Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kate Allman, and I'm one of the organisers of this year's J. Irwin Miller Symposium. I'd like to virtually welcome you all back to the Yale School of Architecture and to this inaugural Yale Mental Health Symposium, titled Beyond the Visible, Space, Place, and Power in Mental Health. This brings us to our penultimate event of the series, Architectures of Mental Health. Today's discussion will look at the history of the asylum within the landscape of our cities and look towards radical reimaginings of these institutions. The notion of the psychiatric institution has had a complicated position in our history. Even the very word asylum is fraught with an array of confused and sometimes misunderstood meanings. The word, in fact, comes from the Greek word asylon, meaning sanctuary. But as our speaker, Kelechi Bozo, reminds us, many of our asylums, even today, are found to be trauma-inducing rather than places of sanctuary, which we so need. Last week, during the home panel, Earl Chambers and Sam Semberis challenged us to imagine how we could design for health equity. And so this will really be the core of our work this evening. For centuries, state mental hospitals were designed as settings of order and control, removing populations labeled as unwell away from the daily life of the city. So how can we creatively and critically intervene in and outside psychiatric institutions to remove the stigma associated with mental health care? Is it possible to build consensus or systems which place the client at the center of decision-making where design is concerned and increase equitable access to mental health care? Richard Sennett writes, civilization has persistent trouble in honoring the diversity of human bodies. And through this discussion, we hope to discover how mental health can not only be honored, but celebrated in our cities. At times throughout this session, you can post questions in the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the panel, we'll unmute guests to ask their questions directly to the panelists. And so our discussion today will be led by our fantastic moderator, Joel Sanders. Joel is the principal of GSA, his LGBT certified award-winning architecture firm based in New York, as well as Mixed Design, a think tank and design consultancy dedicated to creating inclusive design solutions that meet the needs of people of different ages, genders, religions, and abilities. Joel is professor in practice and the director of the post-professional studies at Yale School of Architecture and the author of 3 books, including Stud Architectures and Masculinity, Joel Sanders' Writings and Projects, and Groundwork Between Landscape and Architecture. GSA projects have been featured in international exhibitions in the permanent collections of MoMA, SF MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. The firm has received 6 New York Chapter AIA Design Awards, 3 New York State AIA Design Awards, 3 Interior Design Best of the Year Awards, 2 ALA IIDA Library Interior Design Awards, and design citations from Progressive Architecture. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Joel for serving as an advisor to this symposium. Thank you so much, Joel, for your support and guidance. And so everyone at home, please give a warm welcome to this evening's moderator, Joel Sanders.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. And before I get the proceedings underway, I really do want to take this time to thank you, Kate, Mariana Riobohm, and your cohort for spending really years putting this really important and groundbreaking conference together. And I could spend the next hour just singing your praises, but I just want to say I've been teaching for a very long time, and rarely have I seen the kind of dedication, organization, and spirit that you and your cohort brought to initiating a conference and actually completed it after you graduated. So I just want to give you a huge round of applause because you've set a high bar, which I hope future YSOA students follow up on. So thank you. So let's get underway. By the way, and I also want to thank our Dean Burke, who gave a lot of input and also dedicated a lot of time, resources, and staff to making this program possible. Okay, so previous symposium sessions included the perspective of mental health professionals, clinicians, and designers with expertise in the design of spaces for mental health. And so what I think is kind of an interesting change of pace about this particular panel session is that we've invited artists, two practicing artists, to speculate on the future of this building type, hospitals. And I think that it's a very interesting, what's shaping this discussion is what role can artists sort of play in this important conversation? So let me begin with introductions. First, Hannah Hull is an artist who uses text, drawing, film, song, dialogue, and performance. She is known for her work exploring social issues, including mental health, homelessness, art in prisons, outsider art, and public art. And Hull studied fine art at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she currently holds a practice-based PhD studentship. And Hannah's given talks and workshops internationally, including a TEDx talk in Munich. And her work has received a lot of press, as well as awards and funding from Arts Council England, the Heritage Lottery Fund, the British Psychological Society, Wellcome Trust Unlimited, and the Paul Hamill Foundation. Christopher Payne, who is with us, looks at this overlapping issue of mental health and space, but through the lens of photography, capturing America's vanishing architecture and landscape. Interestingly enough, or I think it is that Christopher is a photographer, but trained as an architect. He's the author of several books, including Asylum, Inside the Closed World of State Mental Hospitals, a 7-year photographic journey through America's vast and mostly shuttered psychiatric institutions, which will be the subject of our conversation this afternoon. And Pei is also working on a new project entitled In Progress that celebrates craftsmanship and manufacturing in American factories that will be published in 2021. Payne is also has a distinguished resume that includes grants that have supported his work through the Grant Foundation, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. And like Hannah, his work has been internationally published, and also he appears frequently, or his work does, at least, in the New York Times Magazine. So, Kate, take it away.
Two projects that I'd like to bring to your attention are Mad Love and Close to Home. So Mad Love is a radical reimagining of psychiatric hospitals, entirely led by those with personal experience of mental health. Myself and my collaborator, James Ledbetter, also known as the Vacuum Cleaner, have travelled all across the UK and Europe visiting hospitals and running playful workshops with patients to create a utopian vision for a new approach to mental health care. Relanguaging these sites of care isn't enough. We need to completely rebuild the structures that support the most vulnerable members of our society. And I believe that this reimagining of the architecture of care could actually be the lens needed to transform our homes and workplaces and courts and prisons and other spaces into places where mental health can thrive. Close to Home is a very intimate exploration of the relationship between home and mental health. I have complex PTSD caused by a series of traumas at home when I was younger, and these traumas have actually manifested as a phobia of home, causing me to move house a couple of dozen times during adulthood. And as a way of trying to process this phobia, I've written a 17-track album and also been commissioned to create a 68-page booklet of poetry and monoprints on the theme of home.
We tend to think of mental hospitals as snake pits, places of nightmarish squalor and abuse, and this is how they have been portrayed in books and film. Few Americans, however, realize these institutions were once monuments of civic pride, built with noble intentions by leading architects and physicians who envisioned the asylums as places of refuge, therapy, and healing. For more than half the nation's history, vast mental hospitals were a prominent feature of the American landscape. From the mid-19th century to the early 20th, over 250 institutions for the insane were built throughout the United States. But in the second half of the 20th century, after the introduction of psychotropic drugs and policy shifts towards community-based care, patient populations declined dramatically, leaving many of these massive buildings neglected and abandoned. From 2002 to 2008, I visited 70 institutions in 30 states, photographing palatial exteriors and crumbling interiors that appeared as if the occupants had just left. Chairs stacked against walls with peeling paint in a grand hallway, brightly colored toothbrushes still hanging on a rack, stacks of suitcases never packed for the trip home. I also documented how the hospitals functioned as self-contained communities, where almost everything of necessity was produced on site: food, water, power, and even clothing and shoes. Since many of these places have been demolished, my photographs serve as their final official record.
Okay. Well, thank you both, Hannah and Chris, for preparing those videos. And I'd like to engage both of you in a dialogue, okay? Based around a series of questions I prepared in advance, but we can see where it takes us. So I wanted to begin with the issue of process, asking both of you to talk a little bit about your approach. Beginning with Chris, how, again, you were trained as an architect. I wonder how your architectural perspective shapes your approach. And given that you're, documenting these buildings, in particular, how is your approach similar or different to that employed, let's say, by a professional architectural photographer, or as well as architects or preservationists who survey and photograph historical buildings? And maybe you could give an example of how you work, maybe using a building from Asylum.
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
I can.
Great. Well, my architectural, I'm trained as an architect, and my architectural background plays a huge role in how I shoot. It helps me structure my images, give them kind of a pleasing composition, so I hope. And it also helps me hone my vision. I'm interested in the built environment and how things are designed and assembled and how they work. And so that's how I kind of approached this Asylum project. I was very much interested in the architecture, but it was also how they functioned as day-to-day self-sufficient communities. The hard part with these hospitals was knowing what to shoot and what to edit out, because these places were the sizes of college campuses. And it was just simply overwhelming, even though I kind of knew what to expect after I'd gotten my feet wet. Showing up on a campus and seeing dozens of buildings and acres of land, it was overwhelming. But the more I saw, the more I realized how similar these hospitals were. They all functioned along the same lines as these self-sufficient communities. And so over time, I was able to edit out the kind of visual clutter and focus on what was perhaps unique to a particular hospital, but was also emblematic and representative of the building typology as a whole. So typically the way I would start would be, I think about what is the quintessential space of the asylum. And that was always the ward. This was the center of daily life and the place where people spent most of their time when they weren't working on the farms. And that the view looking down the corridor with the rows of doors seemed to speak of a very institutional, monotonous way of life. And on their own, it's just a hall, but when you see them together, as I did presented in my book, they become symbols of a closed world. So I'll just show a couple of these shots and we'll see if this works. So this is a view, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Right. So this is a view from Buffalo State Hospital. And so at the beginning, when I'd show up at these hospitals, I would always, I'd wander around and I'd be overwhelmed, but I could say to myself, let's get the ward shot, because this, with 80%, with this single shot, I could cover 80% of what a hospital is, because when you think about it, these older hospitals were really just large dormitories. And so I would always start with this single shot looking down the hallway, because I felt it best typified life at the hospital. And I realized in my book, eventually I would be able to combine all these views, and you could see the typology for what it was, the similarities and also all the differences. So that was in Buffalo, New York. This is in Oregon, where One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was filmed. This is in way out in Illinois. And every hospital had a ward that looked like this. And this is in Minnesota. The idea was that, that was one way to get through a lot of the clutter. And later on in this talk, I'll show some other images. But that's kind of how I began to wrap my head around it. And I wanted my photographs, like any sort of artistic or commercial photographer, to sort of be beautiful on their own, but they also had to possess historic, valuable information that was, documentation that showed how the hospitals worked and what was unique and significant about their architecture.
And Chris, what's the agenda? What motivates the work? Are you interested in, for example, is this a kind of visual archive of buildings that are potentially going to be abandoned? Do you pick them because you think they have a unique or distinctive architectural quality, or is it more a kind of comparison of a kind of building typology that might no longer be extant, or some driver?
If I hadn't visited the largest state hospital ever built, the largest mental hospital ever built in the world, if that wasn't the first one that I stumbled on out in Long Island, it was Pilgrim State Hospital, and it was at its peak, it had over 14,000, if you want to call them, patients. When you find a place like that that's 3/4 abandoned, you ask a lot of questions. You ask, like, who built this? Because it's like it was the size of a small city. Mm-hmm. And you ask who built it, why would they build it, and then why would they abandon it? And so I think the reason why I started this was just to kind of answer some of those questions, because I kept finding the same thing in the weeks following. I found more hospitals like Pilgrim. Some were of the same kind of early 20th century vintage, others were older, but they were all kind of in the same state of disrepair. So a part of this project was kind of to uncover why they were built, what was the design behind them, because there certainly was something typological going on. They all shared these similarities in how they functioned and even in their architecture. And the more research I did, I realized that in the 19th century, they were the largest buildings of their kind in the American, on the American landscape. And I think that's kind of forgotten nowadays, is that how large they were and how much they dominated the landscape in certain local economies and state budgets.
But I guess, on that note, what accounts for the fact that they're all abandoned? Was it because they were obsolete? Was it because protocols of mental health practice require a different building type and they were no longer extant? Was it because, you mentioned, I think you mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and growing up, I can't help but, remember, I was maybe in elementary school, but there were these, was it Geraldo Rivera, but somebody, was uncovering the scandal of what was taking place here, and we were all horrified. Okay, so is that why they were abandoned? So I guess what I'm trying to get at, maybe you can say, why were they abandoned? And then what's your motivation for documenting them? Well,
for their abandonment was due to many reasons. So at their peak in the 1950s, there were like 500,000 people in these places, and they had become, because they were such a convenient solution, they had become repositories for anyone who didn't fit in with society. So that includes not only the mentally ill, but sufferers of epilepsy and other neurological disorders, children, orphans, the elderly, the chronically ill, people who would never get better. And so, but after the peak in the 1950s, you had the introduction of psychotropic drugs, which, you know, theoretically allowed people to live lives on their own, but which also allowed better control of the patients. And then you had a series, at least in the US, a series of court decisions in the 1970s that forbade the use of patient labor unless they were paid minimum wage. And going back a little bit before that, in the 1960s, concurrent with the civil rights movement, you had kind of this, you know, the promotion of patient rights and also this shift towards community-based care, which was great in theory, but, you know, was never really brought to reality. So there are all these forces that, and, you know, these hospitals didn't close overnight. It was like an emptying out over periods of years. And so by the time I was growing up and you were growing up, they had taken on this kind of like, you know, mythology. We knew them as what they had become and not what they once were. And my interest in documenting them was just because I felt like I had stumbled on something which was very significant, you know, that these hospitals, for better and worse, had played a huge role in American society for over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And I was watching these places being demolished, you know, like before my very eyes. And I also realized as I was working on this, and, you know, keep in mind that when you're a photographer or an artist of any kind, you're working in a vacuum of sorts, and you may find something interesting, but you don't know if anyone else is going to find it interesting or worthwhile. And so I was very worried about sharing the project with people. And yet, whenever I mentioned it, I couldn't believe the number of personal connections that people had to these institutions. So, you know, you've got family members who were patients there, grandmothers, aunts. A musician friend of mine had played in a band for the patients. My own father had even worked as an attendant during college, you know, people who had summer jobs. I mean, the list, it was just everyone I talked to of a certain, you know, generation. And so I realized that it was just kind of important to tell this side of the story, because if I didn't, these buildings would be gone.
Got it. Yeah. So interesting, Chris, that you know, one aspect of your pictures that we maybe can talk about later is the fact that they don't literally have people in them, but as you say, the stories of people, the histories of people, and the practices that took place in these hospitals is something that you're very much aware of, and we want to talk more about that. But I want to turn over to the conversation to Hannah, and ask Hannah to also, can you speak about, you know, your process? And, you know, for me as a moderator, you know, and this is so much fun because two artists, yes, but I can't, your work is almost, for me, you know, entirely opposite in a certain kind of way. If this is invested in documenting the past, you seem invested in imagining alternative futures in your Mad Love projects. And this radical reimagining takes the form of community engagement and workshops. So I'm very interested. Can you share with us and our listeners, what is your process, and how do you work to come up with these visions for the future?
Yeah, I think when James and I started putting together a process for Mad Love, James had come from a very much a kind of activist background. And I also had done a lot of work for kind of social change. And I think both of us felt quite exhausted with kind of chipping away at the existing systems that are in place. So I suggested that rather than, you know, try and criticize what already exists, actually kind of really have a very positive and playful utopian project in a kind of, you know, way to try and inspire people and have different sorts of conversations. So we decided to go into psychiatric hospitals and also work with various mental health groups. It was really important to us that at least 75% of the people in the workshops were service users and had personal experience of mental health. James and I both have personal experience of mental health and have both spent time in, let's call them residential mental health care. So we were really wanting to put that voice at the foreground. So we designed a process where people could find their kind of creative voice and create. It's very difficult going into spaces that a lot of painful experiences going into those spaces and trying to create a kind of atmosphere that allows for creative and playful thought. So the workshops are really very much designed around this, being able to take a group of people who are in 24-hour care and enable them to imagine a different possibility. And as I'm sure you can imagine, there's a lot of ethical considerations there, kind of transporting people into a utopian vision whilst they're kind of in a space that maybe is not fully working for them. So our approach has been completely that, but to work with people with personal experience of mental health, starting from a sensory point of view. So we did various kind of warm-up exercises, but the main focus has gone around a kind of sensory palette. So asking people, what does good mental health taste like and feel like and smell like? What's the touch of it? And building out from there. So really not thinking, about buildings in any way, really starting from that direct physical experience and what supports mental health. So we're not going what cures mental health, we're going what supports mental health and building everything out from that space.
Interesting. I want to ask you a little bit more about this kind of question of how you as an artist is generating work or developing work that really is based on end user engagement practices and getting the feedback from the lived experience of people who, in this case, engage with psychiatric institutions. And I'm particularly interested on my own. I've recently started an inclusive design consultancy, and in my teaching at Yale, and I'm trying to unlearn the way I was taught, which is the sort of top-down approach that an architect feels that, the end user is just going to be a straitjacket that will constrain creativity, right? And I'm actually reaching out to professionals and in clinicians, some at Yale Public Health and hospitals, to learn these engagement practices that I think we as architects were not trained to do. Yeah. So let's turn it back to you, okay? A little bit more, first of all, I'm fascinated. Why? You're an artist, so again, you weren't trained to do this. How did you develop these techniques? And I guess what I'm asking, since there's so many designers in the room, the virtual room here, how do you take the feedback that you get? How do you process it and translate it into these stunning, kind of crazy, as you say, playful schemes?
Yeah.
I guess my question is, are the users directly brainstorming, and are you actually creating images from them, or are you somehow, how do they inspire you?
Yeah, I think that's, my practice has always had quite a close relationship with architecture. I've been researching across different disciplines, looking for people who kind of at the front that really foreground social change. So I've worked with a lot of architects who specifically and explicitly are looking to change society through work with social issues and change society, and across design and other areas as well. So it's kind of like a little side interest of mine, architecture, and it's such a different way of thinking. My training as an artist, or how I've ended up specializing, is very much that every single conversation you have can be an artwork. So the process is can be the entire artwork, and that kind of is the case in a way with Mad Love. You know, the workshops are not collecting data. It's an intervention that is intended to empower participants, not just during the workshop, but during the time around it, after it, and to empower staff and any support workers who are there to be able to feel that they could make small changes within the environment. So it's not really just about coming up with a blueprint for a new hospital. In fact, that's just a sort of byproduct. And yeah, to answer your question about those people are designing the space. You know, we collected all of the suggestions. We had a lot of people, when they're on medication, can struggle a little bit with time or understanding process and things that's going on. There's a lot of different abilities in the room. So every time we did a workshop, we'd have an illustrator with us who would actually live draw the ideas on a sheet. So we are kind of translating all of the time these conversations into something visual, collecting all of these different suggestions and putting them in a massive clunky spreadsheet. And then basically the most popular, or to us the most moving or inspiring or just weird, you know, ideas, anything that really caught our eye as well, we would kind of put into we've had various iterations of the Mad Love kind of vision, but one of them has been an architectural model that was on display at a big exhibition here in England. And yeah, all of those ideas are in there. It's directly from there. And really the role of we worked with a couple of architects, their role was really to intervene as little as possible, you know, and only make decisions where there wasn't, you know, where it was absolutely necessary, where there was a gap, and to kind of shape all the rest of it. And we're very careful with the, you know, with the architects that we chose to work with.
That's fascinating. So, you know, some people refer to what you're doing as participatory design, where the end users are actually not just responding to a design created by a professional, but actually generating the ideas themselves. Is that right? Is that
yeah? We call them experts by experience. You know, it's that idea that the person with the most expertise is the person that's, you know, living in these situations, not the architect. So
wow, that's fantastic. And would you say that I mean, I wish I could be a fly on the wall or see how you learn from you, how you conduct these sessions, but would you say that is it the process? Is there something about engaging end users and asking them to weigh in on something that they don't normally weigh in on, that is in a certain way a kind of therapeutic process in itself? Or, and
I think it is empowering, yes. Yeah. I would say, I think it is empowering because however we attempt to relanguage these spaces, there is a power dynamic always going on in terms of education, class, whatever, between staff and patients. And you really, you know, there's some wonderful, wonderful staff out there, but there's always a power dynamic about who can walk in and out of the building and who has to stay in the building and so on. So that kind of empowerment is very acutely important within these kind of situations. And a lot of the work I do as an artist is working with people who are socially excluded, but allowing them to find their own voice. So yeah, absolutely, we kind of are putting the design process in the hands of patients or service users, and telling them, you know, validifying their experience in situations where often they might not feel that they have much of a voice.
Right. So an interesting comparison. So Hannah, you're actively engaging the lived experience of living and breathing humans, right? Asking them to imagine, and for us to imagine alternative futures, alternative environments. Chris, you're kind of doing the opposite, right? You're looking at these abandoned buildings, evacuated of people, right? And asking us to not only look at them for their architectural qualities and even beauty, as you say, but asking us to imagine what they were like, right? And the practices that went on there. But again, you know, I'm so struck, these hauntingly beautiful, stunning images that you present are evacuated of people. So I was wondering, how do you get, if this symposium is about looking at the correlation between built environments and human interaction and human experience, how would you kind of speak to that issue, both in general about the, no people in your images, but what about them? And also, well, I'll ask that first, and then in the back of my mind, I also want to directly maybe follow up on Hannah, because I do understand from reading a little bit of your background that you do conduct interviews, right? That your work, like Hannah's, involves human engagement and research. So maybe let's begin there, okay? And then we can get to the absence of people in your work, okay, which I'm fascinated with, yeah.
So
yeah, no, you go, Christopher.
Wait, what? Who's going and what was the question?
I'm sorry, my role as moderator allows me to be a dictator.
Moderate.
Okay. Chris, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how human engagement practices interviews and what role it plays in your work.
When I started this, I was mostly interested in the architecture, and I was not, when I got permission from all the various state agencies, the stipulation was that I couldn't talk to the patients. So even though you're seeing photos of abandoned buildings, a lot of these buildings were on campuses that were still active. And so, like in the case of that photograph of the ward in Oregon where one flew over the cuckoo's nest, part of that building was actually still in use.
Wow.
So in order to get to some areas of a hospital, I would have to go through the wards, and kind of go up and around, that kind of thing. And I was accompanied, most of the time I worked alone. And so, I was just the only one in the buildings, but a lot of these campuses were in use. Some had been converted into prisons. So a couple of times I would have to go through, the prison areas where the prisoners were. But the stipulation was, and they were adamant about it, is that no people could appear in the photos for patient confidentiality. So it kind of freed me up to focus on the architecture and just the buildings. And I tried to, while I'm doing this, I did a lot of research, and there were some pretty horrific photos that we wanted to put in the book to kind of like temper the work, like the beautiful pictures. But when we tried it out, electroshock treatments, photos, historic photos that had the eyes were covered over or something, so we wouldn't have violated any privacy rules. But when I was going through the archives of the hospitals, I found some very like shocking things. And what was funny is that these images would often appear in annual reports of the hospitals. So you'd get, some guys standing around a new building about to be, for the cornerstone laying with shovels, and all this talk about how they thought the treatment was around the corner. But then you flip a page and the next image is of, patients overcrowded in the wards. So there were a lot of contrasts. These are places of extreme contrast. And so all I could do was just show the spaces empty. But I was always kind of cognizant of the people living there in the photos. And I wanted to take pictures that would suggest habitation, that suggested that someone had lived there, that there was some kind of implied narrative, that the imagination would fill in that void. But I didn't want to play to people's stereotypes and and cliches of peeling paint and too many wheelchairs and we've seen that. I just felt like I needed to show some other things that would also speak to the human side of things, and not try to sugarcoat over anything, but that would try to show every aspect of life at the hospitals. Since the book has come out, I received many emails from people who I didn't know, people who'd worked at the hospitals, who'd grown up on the farms, and former patients, just thanking me for telling their story, not necessarily saying it was, they were happy with the work, but just for thanking me for getting that story out there. But that's a dilemma that, you know, that the photographer faces, an architecture photographer faces, because if you put people in something, it animates it, but it also editorializes it, and it tends to draw the focus on the people and not as much the place.
So, you know, that's fascinating. So in other words, I just assumed, maybe others would as well, that the decision not to include people was, let's say, an aesthetic or a conceptual choice. But you're saying that it was actually something imposed upon you because of confidentiality by the institutions themselves. And my question is, so if they had said, okay, go for it, Chris, you can show people, would you have done it?
I don't think so, just because that's just not, I thought that this project was more about the architecture and the way these institutions worked. And I think you can tell the human story by not only showing the architecture, but by showing garments of clothing and suitcases left behind in an attic, you know, for people who never made it out of there. Various straitjackets, you know, showing the different straitjackets at all the hospitals, because every hospital had its own straitjacket.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm kind of I'm hoping that the viewer will fill in those blanks. And, you know, also from a technical standpoint, a lot of the images I took were like 30 seconds long.
Right.
So if anyone was going to show up in them, it would have been me running through the space, you know, with lights or something. But since the exposures are so long, I don't even appear. So, but, you know, like I said, they were, these hospitals, they were adamant about the whole, they were freaky about this kind of thing. And fortunately, you know, the places I wanted to photograph were usually segregated enough from where the patients were that it was never an issue.
You know, so in other words, so your strategy for asking us to, let's say, through our imaginations, imagine the people that occupy these spaces, is not by depicting them themselves, but as you say, but having sort of mementos or objects or traces of their presence. And maybe this is a stretch, but I'm wondering, you know, I'm thinking of like other, not so much architectural photographers or even polemicists like Le Corbusier, right, who famously would narrate the experience of the Villa Savoy, showing you his glasses or his hat, right, or an emblem, a trace, but never showing the presence of the observer. Is that a trope in architectural photography that you were thinking about that you're applying to your pictures?
It definitely is. You know, there's certain things that I look back on in my photos now, and I would have done them differently, you know, placing the wheelchair in a certain spot, or, you know, there were always images in my mind that I knew I needed. It was like, I had like a checklist, because what I couldn't find at one hospital, I would probably find at another, you know. But a lot of the spaces and the things that I were interested in were not necessarily like patient artifacts. You know, they were more like the more utilitarian objects, like a fire truck, you know, because every place had a fire station, or civil defense supplies from the Cold War, because a lot of the hospitals served as fallout shelters. I just, you know, it had to be, let's just say it had to be a really beautiful straitjacket, or a rack of toothbrushes, or a room full of boxes and files, or, you know, an operating room. It had to be really something special in order for it to make the final cut.
Got it. Good. You know, Hannah, I want to turn the conversation back to you for a second. Again, you know, in terms of contrast, you're imagining alternative futures, but it seems to me that process is almost what's implied, let's say, or inferred, is that it begins with that critique, you know, and again, maybe coming back to that association that I think many of us have, that these institutions have traditionally been, to be kind, spaces that don't necessarily meet the needs of their communities that they serve.
No.
So Hannah, are there hospitals, in other words, was there a paradigm in your mind of what was bad? Was there an example of a hospital that you studied or researched, or a series of them? That,
Yeah,
we got to change this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I've been thinking about that as we've been talking, and I think that you know, I think it is forward looking, and I think that the sort of assumption underpinning Mad Love is that the mental health system that is currently in place is crap. You know, it just isn't working. It's not working for enough people, and it's not, despite many incredible workers, it's not moving in the way that it needs to. There's so many painful experiences. So I actually don't think that we set out to critique a specific architecture. You know, it's actually about you know, an entire system, and I think buildings are a very useful way to illustrate systemic change that you're kind of looking for. It's quite a tangible way to illustrate systemic change. So I think for us, and being very much a process-based artist and people focused, it's trying to go into a room primarily of people with lived experience of ill mental health, without having too many preconceptions about what their experience is. But what our experience, you know, has been with them is that it confirms, you know, our own kind of experience of the mental health system. So yeah, I think it's, you know, it's not necessarily a sort of critique of architecture. I don't know the situation in America, but here a lot of the hospitals are a kind of cross between prison architecture and hospitals designed for physical health issues, and many of them are actually those buildings but kind of renamed. So there's, you know, there's not a ton of you know, amazing. There are great examples, and there are terrible kind of examples of actual buildings. But I think for us, it's more about scrapping it and just going, okay, what if nothing had ever been built? What would we build now with everything that we kind of know as experts by experience?
Interesting. But Hannah, you used the word systemic change, that in part what your work is about is affecting systemic change. And, you know, needless to say, systemic change is a phrase that we're hearing a lot of lately. And you also made the connection, in fact, Chris did as well, between this typology, the hospital, and the space of incarceration, prisons. As others before you. And of course, you know better than I that, you know, one of the you know, lessons that Black Lives Matter is teaching us is that these two building types, right, are historically and continue to be interrelated to one another. They may be part of that prison industrial complex. So Chris, I can't help asking you this question, okay, but what would you say to some who might say, you know, Chris, your pictures are so beautiful, okay, and so pleasing that they risk aestheticizing and actually kind of, let's say, sanitizing and asking us to forget the kind of, you know, as you say, the questionable practices that took place there. What do you think about that?
I could understand that if it depends on which images you select, but I think I took enough of a range of images that show a broad spectrum of visual information. That was, you know, my intention for the book was not to, and the project is not to sanitize, but just mostly to make people aware of what came before, and also to appreciate the kind of like the amount of resources that went into building these places. And I'm not advocating for a return to institutionalizing people, but it's kind of amazing when you see these hospitals, how they were built, how they were designed, the craftsmanship, and then the land that they occupy, these campuses, the beautiful campuses with trees and things. And I guess what I would hope from my photos is that people would appreciate the buildings as they are, as great architecture, and the campuses as they are, and that these places should be preserved for use by people with mental illness and not sold off for private development, which is what's happening all over the country. And so, I mean, there's nothing that makes me more angry than, you know, to tear down an old building that could have some variation of its original use or some new use entirely. And then also the sale of the lands and the tearing down of the trees. I had the benefit of being on these campuses alone. I wasn't burdened by, you know, the mental illness or having to share them with other patients. I mean, I can't imagine having to spend time in one of these institutions in its heyday. You know, I think that, like, at their best, you know, they could be asylums to people who really needed it, but most of the people who spent time there, you know, probably got worse. But that said, I don't think that nowadays, you know, we've got all this land left over in these buildings, and their use should be put to something for their, somewhat related to their intended purpose. But it's something I see all over the country, and I talk to people in the mental health profession who lament the fact that, you know, they're putting up these new buildings, and sure, they meet some kind of current needs, but as soon as they're built, they're kind of outdated, and they're not built as well, and they don't really serve the community that needs it. And then on the other side, we see the old hospital sold for development for condos, or just sometimes they'll just bulldoze the hospital and leave it as an empty space. That hospital I mentioned in Long Island, Pilgrim, which is still kind of partially in use, those buildings were bulldozed 18 years ago. And periodically I'll go back and I'll just see a wasteland of rubble. And the developer kind of walked out and never did anything with the land. And it just seems like such a waste to see the abandoned buildings and the houses where the staff used to live. You know, when you think about housing shortage, it's just an incredible waste of public land, you know, for people who really need it.
Well, you know, that's interesting. I think that your comments, at least for me, bring a new dimension to your work, because, I mean, one can say that if HANA is, in a certain way, part of that project is about envisioning alternative futures for hospitals, I feel like you're saying that yours is almost looking, you know, is a kind of critique, you know, to the forces of development, right? And sounds like it's a clarion call for, you know, historic preservations in the face of, I don't know, development and gentrification. So interesting. I'm looking at the clock, and at 2 o'clock, I promised that we would shift to entertain questions from the audience. But maybe the last question I will ask you both is maybe where I started, that what does it mean that 2 artists are entering into a conversation in a certain way about the future of mental health care? What role, I mean, do you think that you as artists can play in this dialogue? And I would say even more specifically, do some of you feel that, you know, have you had, you know, are there the possibilities, or have you already engaged in alliances with people within the medical and clinical community to affect change? Hannah, should we start with you?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I mean, it really depends on how we define art. So let's start by defining art. No, I'm joking. I think for me, as an artist, I think what James and I have found very practically is that there's quite a people's expectations of an art workshop are quite sort of soft in a way. So we can kind of go in a kind of in this kind of little Trojan horse of nicey art workshops in hospitals, and actually ask some really interesting critical questions whilst people's guards aren't up, because they don't think that we're coming in to do what we're actually going to do, to be perfectly honest. And it's, you know, it's fun, it's playful, and there's no rules. You know, you have used quite a lot of language just in this presentation that is very much drawn from an architectural background, where we're going in and we're prioritizing the language of service users and our own lived experience, our own direct experience. And in art, you know, that's sort of course, that we could do this, you know, do the same thing. There's plenty of art theory and, you know, long words that I find very useful when I'm, you know, reflecting on my practice. But, you know, within art, it's kind of, everything's wide open. So you can kind of do whatever you like while seeming quite friendly. So that's one answer of millions of possible answers. But I'll give that one.
Okay. So it's a kind of stealth practice that you come in masquerading as a kind of innocent artist, and you get to ask these really provocative questions.
We don't say we're innocent, but I do like a good Trojan horse move, I have to say. Okay. I do.
What about you, Chris?
Well, since I finished the book in 2009, I thought the project was over, but it still haunts me, and this topic continues to exert a strong emotional pull, and I find myself photographing. I continue to photograph hospitals, and I've got a whole list of places that I never got to the first time around. And I think the overriding emotion that I'm burdened with is that I feel like I didn't do enough. I keep seeing the buildings torn down. Every few months you read about some scandal in a hospital, or that there's not enough money for the mentally ill. You see people on the streets, and I just kind of scratch my head, and I just, you know, I wonder, you know, how can we fix this? And it just seems like to be such a monumental problem, and all I can do is take pictures, you know, for my own enjoyment. Maybe if someone else will be moved by them, then that's great. But there's a feeling as a photographer that you don't have a huge impact, and so it's frustrating. I hope that the pictures will promote some kind of dialogue, but it's funny that other projects I've worked on, I can let them go. I get burnt out creatively, you know, and then, you know, it's time to move on. But this one, it's just still, it's like every day I think about it, and that's probably why I'm on this symposium, you know, 18 years after this started. It's just that I never feel like I've done enough.
Well, it's probably interesting. I wonder if for both you and Hannah, that you've been at this a long time, but your work is seemingly becoming more relevant and topical, you know, especially, you know, seen against the backdrop of the kind of social justice issues that we're, you know, grappling with today. So it is 2:01, and I promised Kate and Mariana, the conference organizers, that I'd open up questions to the audience. So the first question is from Britta Loeb, and it's directed at Hannah. And so perhaps, Britta, you can share that question with us?
Rita has dropped off the call, unfortunately, but I'll ask the question in her absence. So Rita's question, and this is for Hannah. What do you think of the idea of redesigning prisons to be more trauma-informed and designed in conjunction with people who are incarcerated or system impacted? Can something like a prison, some of the largest mental health institutions, perhaps be redesigned? Can design change a system like incarceration, or does the prison have to be abolished in itself?
Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work with prisons, and I train artists how to work in prisons, and I'm really interested in the crossovers there. And there is a legal aspect too. You know, there is a kind of criminalization of mental health that is very real still, and is making progress. But there are interesting lines there. I personally am an abolitionist. I do think that we need to just you know, get rid and start again. I believe that the majority of people in prisons do. I think there's evidence that, you know, do have mental health issues. Holloway Women's Prison in London, it was the largest female prison in Europe, and was closed down just a few years ago, and I did a residency with them, and that was rebuilt as a hospital, but it is, you know, it was still in the 70s, so it's relatively modern for a prison, or a hospital, in fact, unfortunately, in this country. And, you know, I don't think that it is possible to kind of even rebuilding on site, you know, and keeping the same staff and so on. You know, it'll be very interesting to see how the Broadmoor, Broadmoor is the largest, it's a category A psychiatric hospital, for prisoners basically here. That's just been completely rebuilt, but again, we'll be shifting all of the staff over from one site to the other, so it's not just the building, you know, it's the whole thing. So I think, you know, Mad Lab's very much about, let's go back to the drawing board. You know, what type of people, you know, we ask what type of people support mental health. We're not talking about redoing something that already exists. We're talking about just scrapping it and starting it again. And I think that this as an exercise needs to happen, at the same time, of course, as trying to create as much positive change within the existing institutions as possible. So yeah, that's me, abolitionist. Let's go. Smash it up and start again.
Hannah, I just was wondering, would you say, you know, as you know, that the conversations about, you know, incarceration in prisons is, you know, at the forefront of conversations in America. And as you say, you know, also that these are a form of incarceration or people with mental health issues. Is this conversation, like, how is it shaping up right now in the UK? Is it similar or different? Is it as sort of timely?
With prisons in particular, you mean?
Or that correlation between prisons and issues of mental health in space?
Diagnosis and care is completely overstretched, and it is building momentum, but there simply isn't the support in place. It's not possible. So the diagnosis is increasing. I don't have the statistics, but in prisons, yes, absolutely. More and more people are being diagnosed as having mental health issues. And I think also what we have to begin looking at, I think it was the person who just asked the question, trauma informed and design. You know, the reality is that people that are in prisons were you know, a vast majority of them have been victims of some sort of crime before becoming perpetrators of some sort of crime. And when we start looking at trauma and looking at how you know, how our brains are wired and so on, there's just it's just endless. You know, we have to try and break the cycle, and we can only do that through care, genuine treatment, and so on. So it's happening, but at the end of the day, there's limited resources given to prisons, there's limited resources within prisons, and if you can't help somebody, they're not necessarily going to get help, you know. So it's a tricky one, but I think that the pressure is there, the momentum is there, definitely.
Got it. The next question is from Jim Mandeberg, and it's directed at Chris.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
sir.
So it's kind of a policy question. There, I guess my question said there have been a lot of examples of participatory design and autonomously designed solutions to these problems by people or homeless people with mental health conditions, but they have no influence. They're kind of one-off examples. Typically, they don't disseminate. So I guess my question is, how can innovations in architecture, architectural thinking influence policy? Because that's what holds back the adoption of any of these more innovative models. So what are your, for any of the people on here, what are your thoughts about how that influence could be increased?
That's a tough question. I wish I used to work as an architect. I wish I was still an architect. I think one of the things that I took away from this long after sort of the project was technically finished was that the goal of these these buildings, these places is self-sufficiency, you know, getting someone back up on their feet. And I think if you approach it from that perspective, sort of as like an end, this is what needs to happen, then it starts to inform the design process. Because if you look at it as a typical design, traditional design, then you're going to end up with a traditional looking hospital or a traditional looking prison. I wish more architects would visit institutions. When I was lecturing about this project, it kind of shocked me how few architects were cognizant of this building type and the history, even psychiatrists as well. There just was sort of like, I wouldn't say a willful ignorance, but you know, they're not the most exciting things to work on, healthcare. It's not like the flashy thing that people gravitate towards. So I really wish that architects would spend more time immersing themselves in this building type and kind of what needs to come out of it, which is, you know, this return to self-sufficiency. I will say that a great model that I have seen in here in New York City is this place called the Living Museum, which is at Creedmoor, former Creedmoor State Hospital, and they've turned an industrial kitchen into an art therapy studio. And having visited some of the world's, you know, great like cultural sites, I can say that this was as good, if not better than any of them. It was so moving to see art therapy and how it can transform a space and how it affects people's lives in a positive way. So I think that, but that is a non-traditional model, and it's very difficult to get people to think outside of that box. I don't know if that answered your question, because I don't really know what the answer is, but it's probably why I'm still working on this project.
Okay. Next question is from Trudy Watt. Trudy, are you there?
Hi, I'm so grateful for this conversation and just the whole symposium. Thank you so much, the organizers. Can I ask my second question instead of the first one, which I feel there was such a great discussion already about the lack of people.
Yeah, be my guest, go for it.
Great. Well, I'd love to just hear what you think. I was so struck by what you pointed out, Chris, about the fact that these were the most massive buildings in a lot of towns in terms of like literally mass and materiality and craft, and they're fortresses and they stand forever and they provided a ton of jobs. So that tells me that at that time, there were so many more resources poured into creating institutions, and also perhaps maybe a different awareness of the connection between architecture, power, and health. So I'm curious, you know, to hear from both of you. I also love the idea of the Trojan horse. So like, how is that power or lack of power legible today? And what do you think institutions might look like if that awareness of the connection between architecture and health were more sort of commonly held? Would we see this sort of resourcing of institutions again, even if they don't look like fortresses? Maybe they look like something else.
I'll jump in if that's okay. You're totally right. It's when I was doing this research and uncovering old photos and these postcards where they show hospitals so big that the postcards are in diptych or triptych form. It's just incredible the resources that were poured into this, even if the motivation to do so is not entirely altruistic, because, you know, with the proliferation of the asylums, you had prisons, you had public schools, you had universities. You know, it was a way of that Victorian impulse to control and organize, and definitely to control the segment of the population that didn't fit in. When we try to imagine, like, I think what the new architecture would look like, I'm thinking of it right now. I'm thinking of these new workplaces, you know, these new high-tech workplaces that look less like offices and more like, you know, giant lounges. And I don't know if that's the appropriate mental health setting, but something that's obviously less restrictive, but it still has a same generous endowment of resources and land, because without that, you know, you're going to keep getting the same problems over and over. You have to devote funding to this, but unfortunately, mental health is something that doesn't really generate profit. So you're dealing with a marginalized segment of the population and an illness that, you know, is often criminalized or viewed as such. And so it's really hard to devote this kind of resources that you would to some other kind of experimental architecture.
Okay. Let's see. The next question is from Jen Shin and is directed at Hannah. Jen?
I think Jen may be struggling to unmute,
Hi.
but oh, no, there you go. Go for it, Jen.
I'm here. Sorry.
Hi, Jen. We know each other.
Hi, Jen.
Oh,
So I could,
sorry
oh
about
yeah.
that. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. Can you hear me now?
Now, perfectly.
I can hear you, yeah.
Hi, and hi, Joel. It's nice to see you here. My question is it a privilege to imagine alternative futures, and how then do we balance the ethics of this type of important work in a setting where individuals with lived experience may never benefit from such imaginings? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Jen, I saw your questions in the question box, and I'm really pleased to have been asked it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a massive privilege. I think it's something that I'm quite aware of in general with my artistic process, is that if you go into somewhere and go, okay, we're going to use your brains to do something somewhere else, you know, that's a huge ethical issue, I think, especially when you're working with excluded people, vulnerable people. So the process, how I've resolved that for myself, as much as anything else within the MadLove process, is to ensure that there's something going directly back in as part of the MadLove workshop. So, you know, it is very much focused on empowering people to see what changes they can make on an individual level, and also we leave we don't leave, but we send kind of the outcome of the workshops back to the hospitals, and you know, request that they consider directly, you know, changing the environments based on some of the suggestions. And there are staff, you know, a few members of staff in the workshops who are there to listen. So I think that what we're doing, you know, we are giving voice to patients in a way that they're not usually given voice, and that does kind of directly go back in. So that's something that I'm very much aware of. And I think it is a privilege, but I think all education is a privilege. I'm from a very working class kind of background. You know, I think being able to think in a certain way about things is absolutely a privilege. And that's something that I personally take, you know, take very seriously. I think that if we have we're lucky enough to have received an education at some level, that we have an obligation to allow society to benefit from that education in some way. So yeah, I agree. I mean, I just agree with you. So that's my answer.
Okay. Next question is from, I might be mispronouncing the name, beautiful name, Belen Vos Luis. Belen?
Hello, good afternoon. Yeah, it's so interesting all you say. So in this way, my question is for Christopher. After having been in so many mental hospitals, what should be copied in our designs for this typology of buildings? On the other hand, what do you think what do you think we should never copy from the Kirkbride style? And thank you, Hannah, for answering my other question. Thank you.
So if I'm correct in understanding your question, what shouldn't be copied in that older, the Kirkbride style, which was the dominant 19th century design. So, and that's something that I thought about a lot as I'm wandering through the buildings. from an outsider's point of view, just someone walking by, the buildings tend to look very ominous and imposing and creepy. Once you get inside them, you realize that they're kind of different than what you'd imagine. They were much more light and airy because they had high ceilings and huge windows. So I think if you took like the original philosophy behind that design, which was light, air, ventilation, views to the outside, that should be replicated. As soon as you put up bars and observation windows and kind of things in repetition, like all the doors, then it sets up like a dynamic, you know, between the person who is a patient there or a prisoner there and the person who's in control. And so that sense of observation and confinement, you know, if you got rid of that and kept the kind of more salubrious qualities of the hospital, like the setting, the trees, the campus, a building with light and air, intimate spaces, things that aren't too regular or repetitive, I think that would be a good starting point.
Thank you.
Okay, next. Let me see. There's an I'm told that there's an anonymous attendee, so I'm going to need to address this, read this question out loud. Kate, how about it? Can you address that? Can you do that for me?
Sure. So this next question from anonymous attendee. This is an interesting discussion about what artists think about what they have seen or will reimagine. The question is, can design be interpreted by a user or patient? Can it influence what they think? I'm a patient. Can you create a place or space that causes me to think I am welcome or safe?
Yeah, okay. I'll with Mad Love, our sort of the whole thing is, we call it Mad Love, a safe space to go mad, which implies, you know, two things. One, that we're not necessarily preventing the experience of madness unless the patient wants that, and secondly, just reclaiming that safe space, you know, the original definition of Asylum. And that's very much at the heart of what we've been trying to do. I think safety, you know, is that's what we're all looking for it, and mental health is certainly, you know, a spectrum when it comes to that. So I hope that you know, that is what we've been trying to achieve. It's a shame that it's anonymous, because I sort of want to know a little bit more about what a safe space would mean to the person who's asked it. What have you got anything to add to that, Christopher?
Yes, I would definitely say that the idea, I think that's the goal of all architecture, is shelter. That's like the first thing that you learn in school. And when, you know, you come to school with these big ideas, and the first assignment is, you know, to design like a hut or something, you know, just some basic shelter. And that's what, before you can do anything, before you can get better, you need a sense of safety. I mean, that's what the home is. And so the ideal hospital would have, would offer that, and I think in a way that's not obvious. But it could start, you know, with people getting their own rooms, or just having informal spaces to gather, plenty of landscaping, trees to cover your head, you know, nice pathways. I mean, it's just, and that's why I still think you can't release, not everyone can live in society with mental illness. And this is what I've been told. There's always going to be a segment of the population that requires care. But for that population, instead of treating them as prisoners, then they should feel safe. And and with safety also comes some amount of kind of freedom, veracity in the building, and the feeling like you can go in when you want to, or you can leave, that you're not confined. Because there's, you know, you might be safe in a prison cell, but it doesn't mean you feel safe.
Absolutely. I think one of the interesting kind of challenges in a way with mental health hospitals is that a lot of them are designed to keep the public safe from the crazy people, or the crazy people safe from themselves. And one of the really kind of interesting, well, a couple of interesting points that people brought up during the workshops, you know, one is like the idea of building a space that people aren't trying to escape from. You know, if you don't want people to, you know, run off, and you want people to stay and be treated, then create a space that people actually find truly beneficial and you know, actually is working for them and makes them feel safe and well. And another one is, you know, this idea of really being in charge of your own treatment to quite the extreme. And a suggestion that actually came up a couple of times was that patients would be allowed a, you know, that there would be a padded cell, but the patient would have the key, you know, that there was a space where you could actually choose to go and let off steam rather than being kind of, you know, confined into to let off steam. So all of that idea, you know, the idea of safety and how to make someone safe, you know, actually feel safe, not be safe, you know, which is obviously a judgment, is a really interesting one.
Terrific. Okay. Well, you know, I'm looking at the time right now. It's 2:24. So one of my roles as moderator is to keep time. And so I think I'm going to thank the audience for their valuable questions and for your important responses. And just wrap up. So the organizers asked me to kind of sum things up, which is putting me on the spot, but I'll do the best I can. And so, you know, first, I hope that this panel discussion has proven that, in fact, artists do bring a new perspective to an urgent and difficult conversation, and really have, you know, again, shed new light on topics that we think could more, you know, traditionally be dealt with by clinicians or professionals. And maybe it was a question I asked, but I really could imagine that as we think about alternative futures, that there could be possibilities, you know, for workshops and collaborations that could involve, you know, designers, artists like yourself, as well as healthcare practitioners, to come up with viable proposals. Second, I just wanted to say that while, you know, Chris and Hannah, you're both artists, and at first glance, as I said, it would seem that your work has opposite agendas. Chris, you're invested in documenting abandoned historical structures threatened to be demolished, while Hannah conducts participatory design workshops, you know, whose mission is to gather ideas that she then translates into visions that would improve the spaces of mental health care in the future. But I think this conversation challenged my preconception entering into this panel. This kind of, maybe what I'm realizing was a kind of false binary that sees your work as oppositional. In fact, it seems to me your work, you know, is incredibly complementary. And I think it's fabulous, by the way, when seen in relationship to one another. I think, you know, it's clear that both of you are, each in your own way, invested in making work committed to, we talked about that, systematic change in society and the healthcare system, as well as, I never thought we'd be talking about this, as well as real estate development in the case of Chris's work. But what I also, for me, is interesting is that in different ways, history is part of this initiative. And you know, one of the things that a colleague of mine, Susan Stryker, likes to say, and I think she's actually maybe quoting Walter Benjamin, but who knows? Okay, but you know, but this idea that one of the kind of lessons of history is that it teaches us that in the same way that the present can be different from the past, you know, by extension, that the future need not look like today, but it could be different. In fact, it could be better. And I think there's something, even though you're dealing with a very dark topic, or what some people think is a dark topic, I think there's something ultimately uplifting and hopeful about both your work. And I hope the audience agrees. And I think that's especially important considering the extremely challenging times that we're living in. So thank you both very much for taking the time to share your provocative work with us. And
thank you, Joel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great summary.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience, and most importantly to Kate and Mariana and the other YSOA students who put today's panel together, as well as this whole symposium. Thank you. And thank you, Dean Burke. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.